Hey guys, so in this video we're going to talk about Cloudflare containers, what they are. I'm going to show you how you can actually get one deployed, and I'm going to talk about some of the benefits of running a cloud container in Cloudflare. This is one of those technologies that I'm actually really excited about. Generally speaking, I'm not a container fan, but Cloudflare containers for sure has gotten me pretty excited about sort of the possibilities of what you can do with it. I actually did some early testing with their containers because it's actually still in beta. And a couple of things really stood out to me that I just really like some of the concepts. So in this video, I'm going to give you a full walkthrough of how you can get started with a container. I'm going to show you some of the gotchas, some of the things that I discovered. I don't think it's as elegant as it should be. And I know the team at Cloudflare are definitely working pretty hard on this. So I plan to really kind of follow them on this journey and hopefully iron out some of these kinks around the container. I just want to give you my raw overall guide on how you could actually get your container up and running in Cloudflare. We'll talk about some of the benefits. I did a Reddit post maybe about 3 months ago. Yeah, it does say 3 months ago there. Talking about the container and the fact that I spent 8 hours just trying to get a container running. This post got quite a bit of traction. It has 85 upvotes and a few thousand views. It got to the point where even the PM felt like he needed to respond to some of the comments about it. One of the things that I mentioned was that the cold start for the container from Cloudflare was about 13 seconds. I was actually very excited about that fact because at 13 seconds, it was faster than anything I've seen at the time. Now, that's my thought process a little bit skewed around this. I know there's some faster cold start containers, but in my experience, because I've been sitting on Azure, this has been a very frustrating thing for a while. So seeing a container that could hit 13 seconds was just amazing. That being said, it was a .NET application, so there's some lag in terms of getting .NET up. Since then, I've been switching my tech stack to work with Go for backend because it's a significantly faster platform. Plus, it dramatically simplifies deploy and working with containers, in my opinion. The post that I put out, the PM came out and said that 13 seconds on a cold start was really slow for them. This was a bug they've highlighted. And I think in here, if I'm not mistaken, I think they were quoting something like 5 seconds on a cold start, or an average, or at least that's what they're aiming for. So we're going to find out if that's true. I haven't actually tested anything around the container since then. I got busy with some other stuff, but I've been meaning to kind of come back to this topic. So I'm really excited to dive into this a little bit more. And like I said, I'm going to give you sort of my overall take about it, but also tell you why you should use it. Let's just talk about that right now. What are containers, in case you're new to the topic altogether? At its bare minimum, a container is essentially just a computer with your package files or application code running in it. The reason why this is important is because not every platform allows you to run every type of code that exists. For example, if you wanted to run a video editor to compress some videos or convert video into GIFs, you can't run that on a platform. It just doesn't exist. So you have to run it in a container, package it up, and then deploy it to the internet, right? Now, the benefit to this is with a container type technology is that you could spin up the container, run whatever request or workload that you have, and then turn the container off when you're not using it. This is really beneficial because it allows you to save tremendous amount of cost, right? Most people, including myself, for a really long time, I have not weren't as focused on containers because my thought process was, if I'm running a container, why don't I just spin up a virtual private server and put my code on it, and then, it just runs all the time. This was a fair argument, but the short answer is it just boils down to cost. And the truth is, recently in my experience as a developer, I've been dramatically switching to containerized technology after getting some hefty bills from Azure. So this idea of running computers or servers at the edge or containers at the edge and being able to have them spin up, do a very quick workload and shut down really fast is really appealing to me personally, but also for the industry. I think it's time we shift the narrative around from sort of like, containers have to be sort of in these large enterprise environment with a lot of complexities, hint, hint, Kubernetes. So that's sort of my general take on it. There's a couple of interesting things that I kind of like about the containers, and there's a couple of interesting things that I'm like, maybe it could be improved, specifically with Cloudflare Containers. So let's talk about this for a second. Here, I got the rough map from a Cloudflare website. Essentially what they're doing is, let's say that you're a user in North America here, and you send out a request to their network. What they'll try to do is they'll try to spin up a container. Hopefully you could see that. Sort of like very close to, the concept is if somebody else is on the other side of the world and they hit one of the Cloudflare networks, they're going to spin up a container somewhere close by. Contrast this to AWS and Google, where you have to allocate containers to a specific region. If you need that, you have to maybe set it up in a different region. Then you have to kind of be responsible for the load balancing. With Cloudflare's version, you don't have to think about load balancing. The Cloudflare workers. And that gives it an advantage because the Cloudflare workers are already spread out all across the internet. So you're hitting your servers at a very quick rate and then getting quickly routed to your server. Even if it's across the globe, it would still be fairly fast. At least that's my understanding at this particular time. Now, the truth is, I'm not very clear. It's still in beta, so I'm sure they're working out a lot of details. It's not very clear as to when they would copy that server across the globe. So for example, let's say I have tons of users hitting my North America location, and then I sign up one customer that's in Australia, and they're going to do requests against that. The question for me that I still haven't gotten any kind of proper answer on is what happens to that user. My understanding right now is that it's going to hit the next closest region where that container exists. Now, if, Cloudflare is not accustomed to seeing traffic from this part of the world, does that mean they're going to route me back to North America? Does that mean that they're going to copy a container to that region so that subsequent requests could start hitting that container? Those are the things that I'm not very clear on, and those are the things that I plan to, in the next coming weeks/months, kind of test out. So with that, if you're actually interested in just following on the journey about Cloudflare Containers, feel free to subscribe. We're going to go on that journey together. But all in all, I'm pretty bullish about it. Let's jump into a couple other benefits as to why you would want to run a container, and then we'll actually try to set things up. In the past, one of the biggest limitations with Cloudflare altogether is if you had a application of some sort and you're using Cloudflare because of their security, this is my shield, to protect your application, and maybe you've migrated to using their workers. Workers were fantastic in the sense that they were just super lightweight, call them little executables that you could run at scale in the cloud that would address 90% of request traffic. There's queues, there's key value store that could deal with a bunch of stuff. But there was one big problem with this. Cloudflare has their own database. It's called D1. Basically a SQL Lite database. This is great, but I think the limitation right now is 10 GB. That's fine if you have some really light loads. They have some very compelling use cases. So when you would do this, their vision is that you would just spin up multiple of these D1 databases. And the fact that you could cap it at 10 gigabytes allows them to move it around really fast. That being said, if you have an app, which we do, with significantly more data than 10 database, D1 database is just not going to cut it. So what ended up happening is you run into this problem where you have this really fast front end. Your users hit the Cloudflare network. You could potentially hit a worker. And then as a request comes in, it spins up more workers to address that request. However, there is a limitation in that Cloudflare workers do not support sockets. C-K-E-T-S. So sockets, meaning like TCP IP cuts sockets to a database. So this was kind of a problem. And the reason why it's a problem is because if you needed to do any single thing database related, you couldn't. So what would happen in my particular case and most people's case was they would revert to sort of a traditional server. And that traditional server would basically take in a request and then forward it back to their database. And then sort of, run it back through HTTP. That's how most people would deal with this. There's another reason why I think Cloudflare is doing this. Because of how Cloudflare workers work, it's not a good idea to have these workers spin up and connect to the database, what would end up happening is you would end up DDoSing the database on the back end. Or you would just flood it and you would just block all of the connection pools because of the nature of how Cloudflare workers work. The workers are designed so that they have a latency, a cold start, which is not even a cold start, of 5 milliseconds. It's extremely really fast. So as requests is pouring in, these workers sort of spin up in a rapid manner. If you were to create a socket connection to the database for every single one of those workers, that would just overpower your database. You would just bring it down. That's kind of the problem at hand. And for this reason, I think one of their design choices was to not have any sort of socket connection or TCP connections that could go through to a database. So this creates sort of a problem. The way they've been dealing with it in the past, and I promise this will make sense as to why the container problem is so, the container solution is a real thing. So the way Cloudflare has been dealing with this is if you wanted to still use your workers to connect to a database, they had this thing they call hyperdrives. Those connections would connect to this hyperdrive technology that they're calling. And what that would do is they would be responsible for kind of pooling the connections that are coming in and sort of almost trickle the connection to the database. And that's how you're getting around the ability to connect to your database in the cloud. In my opinion, it's not the most elegant solution. It forces all the traffic to run through this sort of hyperdrive thing, which is, running on Cloudflare's network. So it's pretty fast, right? But it's sort of a one additional layer of complexity that you needed to think about and deal with. I'm sure there's some cost attached to that. So fast forward, hence containers. So with the containers, the goal is now you can have an application come through directly to Cloudflare's network, spin up a container in the closest region to that customer, and then have that connect directly to a database without having to deal with the hyperdrive issues and the limitations around socket connections. This is why I'm really excited about it, because once you do a deployment to Cloudflare containers, they're responsible for spreading it across the internet. They're responsible for spreading it in wherever region is closest to your users, and you as a developer don't have to think about those details. Very compelling argument as to why you should use a container. Hopefully that's giving you some understanding of that. If you got some value from this, if you could subscribe to the channel, that would be fantastic. It would really help me out. So I appreciate that. So one of the ways in which containers are more unique than what you would do on Docker, Kubernetes, Azure Container Apps, or any of those other services, Amazon ECS, is the fact that you have a container and a worker that's kind of paired together. The way they're doing it is they're kind of reusing their network to the sense that whenever a traffic comes in from a web app and hits their network, it first gets routed to the worker. The worker is like the front door to the container. In fact, from my knowledge, there's no way to get to the container without having to go through the worker. And the worker allows you to do things like log in and all the benefits that a worker gives you today. It tunnels or forwards traffic into the container in the back end. I'm not necessarily convinced that the worker and the container are always together. In fact, I'm almost certain they're not. The container might be 1 or 2 hops away in our closest next region. That's my understanding, at least in the beta stage. So with that, it comes with some interesting setup quirks. You have to specify the configuration details at the worker level to drive the container. So I just wanted to kind of highlight that because that was a little confusing to me at the start. In fact, I actually labeled that in the blog post. I'm going to link this blog post in the chat, so that in the description, so that you could actually look at it if you wanted to get more details. But just as a side note, that's basically how you have to treat containers, as though they're part of workers, and use these bindings to connect them together. Okay, so let's get our first container sort of up and running. The first thing you need to do is a Wrangler CLI. Once you have the Wrangler CLI from Cloudflare, you're going to be able to do npx Wrangler login. Okay, what that will do is that will pop up a window so that you can connect via Auth0 like this. Once you're connected, then you're able to continue at this particular level. Okay, so with that, the template you need to use is npm create Cloudflare at dash template. Basically this command. Let me just copy and paste, it'll be easier. So the template you need to use is this command, npx create Cloudflare and then template. This is a bootstrap template to get you going. And it's going to create this folder. Now it'll ask you what directory you want to create the template in. It generates random names, Ollie, Renaissance kind of deal. For this demo, we're just going to do a basic name. We're just going to name it YouTube, right? This is something that we can remember. And it'll ask you a few other questions, but for the most part, it's straightforward. It installs at this point, ready to go to deploy to Cloudflare. So that's actually a really good thing about the experience altogether. The Wrangler CLI, the guys that worked on the team, did a fantastic job making it feel very natural. I'm going to say no for GitHub because I'm not going to push this into GitHub, and ask me if I want to deploy the container already. I'm going to go with no for now, and we'll come back to that. So with that, I have a container, cd YouTube container. I got my container to code, and now I'm able to open up Visual Studio Code, and I have my container. Let's make this a little bigger. So what are we looking at? It has this container underscore source file, src. It already has a Go mod, which I find interesting, and it has a main Go implementation, basic implementation, but nonetheless an implementation. It has a source file with an index.txt. And what does this do? This index.txt file is just there so that they can take the request in and route it. They're handling the container route a little differently. They're saying /container to go to the container route. Whereas if you do the home page, you'll just get this. So we could change this to /API. Let's say we wanted the container to have an API, and essentially I'll pull up the container from container. So API is an example ID. And if I go to my container here, I'm just going to change that to API. So let's just run it locally just to make sure that it's actually running correctly. So here we got local postman, and we could do API. Now I'm forgetting the URL that I have, but let's just see what happens. There we go. It is my first container instance set up. So with that, it's actually pretty straightforward. I am a container. Please subscribe to my YouTube. See what I did there? So with that, we have a fully working container. Just going to see, run this, src, and it's pretty straightforward from this particular point. So from there, the only thing that you need to do, because the Docker file is already set up for you, it pulls in Alpine, runs as a build, download all of the dependencies, do a static build, and then pull in all the certificates for a very lightweight Scratch image. So this is an extremely light image. And also on the index file, because we're going through the worker, this index file is sort of like the entry point to the Go application, and then the request is being forwarded. So it is possible, we're using Hono in this particular case, so it's possible that you can, one, obviously subscribe to some of the event lifecycle hooks of the container, so you know when the container was started, when the container was stopped, when there was an error on the container, and this allows you to trigger logs to any sort of third-party system if need be. And then here you have an app request that is focused on giving back some kind of requests on the initial default URL, whereas this URL here is routing to the container itself, container.fetch raw, passing in the raw request there. So this my container flag that you're seeing that we're basically using here is a binding. So the way how it connects this my container name to, I think it's through this Wrangler file. And in the Wrangler file, see here, it's called my container. So this is a bind-in. So I could change this. Let's just call this my YouTube container as an example. So I would have to do that. I would have to make sure that this is the same. And then there's a durable object that kind of runs side by side the container. So this is where it gets just a little wonky, at least for me, because if you're coming from a traditional background of containers and you're not accustomed to Cloudflare's way of doing things, this, like, why do I need a durable functions? Why is there a worker? Like, it's a little messy. And the only way I could explain it is the request is sort of, think of the worker as the front door where the request is coming in, and the durable object as something that lives beside the container to manage its life cycle and its state. And at least that's the way that I understand it so far. And hopefully that makes a little bit of sense. This durable object allows it to push data, communicate between the container. So yeah, and then here, like I said, you could change this to my container, so we'll just change this to YouTube container. Okay, container, my YouTube container. So this migration, I have no idea why it's there. I can't tell you. I didn't see anything in the documentation. Maybe I overlooked it, but I can't answer that question. I do know that this container class name is basically we're using to access the container, and then this is a binding name to bind between the durable function and the container itself. Hence, you're able to do this sort of magic here, right, where you just put that. So that's what that is, right? And we want to name, what else did I change here? My container. This is not my YouTube container, my YouTube container. So let's just see if it builds. So see that name, just make sure that I got that right. Yeah, right. So this is the binding here. This is the TypeScript bindings. So I think there's a way for you to run this so that it actually automatically updates this bindings. I'm not entirely certain of the command for that, so I'm just going to manually change it for now. Oops, so is it this YouTube container? Forgot already. Let's just double check. And then if we go back to here, fantastic. So this does give you some concepts to think about as you structure things. The way how I'm thinking about this container is really just supposed to be very lightweight implementation to do maybe connect to a database, get some data, push it into cache, do some kind of background job. You could obviously do process images, maybe even AI, or something along the lines with WebSockets that needs some connection to a network, an outside network. So that's how I'm thinking about things. The format is pretty good because it basically just follows an HTTP format that you could then think. But I don't know if it makes sense for you to mix sort of like, you know, traditional routes with a container route. Like I would personally just leave it directly to container. So in other words, I would get rid of this, well, errors and whatever else will leave, but more or less it would be something like, let's say I'm just ignoring errors for now. It would just be like this. So any request that comes in has to go to / API route just so I could get to the container. One thing I wanted to do was just do this for the container itself. Let's get AI to do it. Can you put a GUID on the print line so that every time I refresh the API where it says hi Dwayne, please subscribe, that we could see a generated GUID. Oops. Hi Dwayne, please subscribe to my YouTube. This way we could see every time a request comes in and it changes the GUID. I'm learning Go, so I'm not very detail oriented with how to do even some basic things. So AI comes in handy for this. If you're learning a new language, I would highly suggest that you write code manually, like old school, just so you can commit it to your brain. I've been doing that in the previous, when I was prepping for this video, I wrote the entire thing by hand, just so my brain could connect the pieces as to why they're doing certain things. Perfect. Okay, so every time we do a request, at least we'll see that something is happening. So you could do, or just to make sure that it's going to work in Cloudflare Container, you could do npx. What I'll do is actually build the container locally. Okay, so I have a Docker is now launch. Need to ensure that Docker is launch. Good. So once Docker gets spinned up here, if I were to rerun it again, npx Wrangler dev. So npx Wrangler dev is the command, and that's going to basically build the container locally and actually spin it up so I could actually run and test it if I wanted to test it. I already know it is working, but we're just going to do that for the sake of getting it done. So the first build will take a little bit of time. Okay, so with that running, we can go back to Postman and we could change that to this URL. We should basically get the same thing. Let's see. Localhost 8787. Okay, it looks like I made a mistake here because my routes are not working anymore. Let's go back here and undo this. So I need to get the route for the initial and then / ID. So what am I missing here? Let's just go back. Local service started. Click that, click on send. There we go. That's working. So API not found, but if I do / there, perfect. Okay. So with that, that's our local working. So what's this error? Connection refused. So Wrangler's working locally, our containers running locally. So that's it. Pretty much from there, it's pretty straightforward. The only thing we need to do to get it to our container. So let's just go look at our container folder here. Here I have workers Under the Cloudflare Containers, there's no container section. It has to be under compute and workers. With the durable object, you can now go to Wrangler, npx, Wrangler deploy. Because you already built the container locally, now it'll try to rebuild the container if there's any changes. I've already logged in, I showed you how to do that. And so it's just going to take that and dump it to the container registry. It's basically pushing it to that registry. Then it's going to do the deployment to the YouTube container. Deployed YouTube container trigger, 1.5 seconds. Pretty fast. Obviously, it's a really small container, so the time is different. And then, so here we go. We got the YouTube container. So every single thing from this particular point pretty much applies as though you're dealing with a worker. And I think that's kind of the beauty about this interface, is that they didn't really create a new implementation. I kind of like the idea and not at the same time, because it's really just a worker, right, on the front end. And so here, this is the URL. We could take this and we could change this. Now they say it does take a while to spin up, but in my experience so far, it's been really fast. All right, so let's see how long it takes. 100, 2 100, 3 100. There, that's it. 2 seconds from 0. So super fast. Now we're in millisecond territory, 100 and take, right? Now, obviously this is a hello world container, so it's not a real world situation. As you start putting more load in the container, the spin up time will definitely vary. But honestly, from everything I've seen so far, this is pretty astounding. Like, it's just a phenomenal technology. It stands up. At least, you know, I haven't hammered it with load. In another video, I'll try to give it some real load and see where it breaks. Stay tuned for that. If you haven't subscribed already and you haven't, you know, if you're getting value from this, please subscribe. It really means a lot to me. Super small channel here, just trying to grow, share my knowledge with the world. So with that, there are some things you can do. You see here, it will show you sort of like the requests of the requests that are coming in. YouTube container there. So there is some login. You can do live login. So let's go back to this example, right? So the question is, how do you secure this thing? Well, you could secure it in any of the other ways that you would secure a worker. You could use their zero trust technology. By the way, I just did a video on that. So if you're interested in how to do that, you can use that. Just lock it down behind authentication system. Or you could use, who knows, you know, the JWT implementation. So if you go to their help, they got a JWT authentication helper, and you can just basically pull in this package into your front end, and then you can do all of the standard stuff to sign the token, inspect the payload, verify, all that type of stuff. So this is actually pretty good. Essentially what you're doing is you're putting a barrier in front of the container by using Cloudflare workers, yes. And the worker has all of the implementation for security and authentication and header checks, and you can put some business rules around it. So it still gives you all of the core benefits. And I think that that's the smart genius move about it. It does require that you merge these two concepts together, the Cloudflare technology stack with traditional container stack altogether. A couple things to think about. When you do a deployment on this, if you're trying to scale it up to multiple containers, right now, because it's in beta, you have to manually do it. There's no way to do auto scale. The good news here is that you don't have to deal with Kubernetes, which, you know, I don't know about you, but it's just, yeah, it's a whole lot of thing by itself, right? For me personally, what I'm trying to use this for is to be able to directly connect to Azure Cosmos DB, because we got a ton of stuff sitting there. And so using Azure Cosmos DB in the back end through a container allows us to kind of get data requests coming into a worker, push it to a container, and then connect it to the database directly. I'd say it's definitely one of those things that if you are setting up a new container for the very first time, this is a viable choice, because scale wouldn't necessarily be your immediate concern. Just get functionality and then maybe build out the technology and the platform. You'll be able to benefit from the scale and implementation there. With that, I'm hoping that you got some value from this video. Hopefully you've subscribed. If you haven't already, please do. Looking to grow this channel, as I mentioned. Stay tuned for the next video. Have yourself a wonderful day.